Now, as we move into our program for today, I want to say that we're moving on to a series which we actually began last week. The name of the series is Legacies and Futures. And we're focusing on the legacies in process relational thought and life. And we're focusing on those from many different directions. Last week, we had a beautiful, beautiful tribute session to John Cobb. And in fact, this focus on legacy and future is intended to give honor to him, because his big concern as he was passing from this world was that he cared about the future of the process movement. And he cared about it because he thought it had potential to change the world. He thought it was already doing that, and he wanted to see that to continue. And he did not want to see it focus on him, but he wanted it to focus on the movement itself. Not that he was trying to belittle himself or exercise false humility, but because he really saw this as a cosmic movement and he wanted it to be. So today we jump right into the middle of legacy with Michael Flannery. Michael has come to us through the gracious introduction of Andrew Davis. And Andrew Davis, who is the Director of Scholarship and Research for the Center for Process Studies, is going to join into this conversation as Michael finishes his presentation. Now, Michael is a fascinating man. He's Professor Emeritus of the Libraries for the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He also was Assistant Dean of Historical Collections there. Now, earlier, he was Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. During his 17 years in Birmingham, however, he was very actively teaching. And among the subjects he taught were the history of medicine for the Department of History, and courses for the Honors College in History and Philosophy of Science. So you begin to get the picture that this is a specialist in philosophy and science. And he has studied leading figures of the past and their contributions and the reevaluation of their contributions. He will be sharing some of that today. So he's a specialist in the whole area of philosophy and science. He's also a specialist on one particular person, John Elof Boodin. Is that how you pronounce it, Michael?
Yes, Boodin. Yes.
Good. And he is the figure that Michael will focus on today. He published and produced a new edition on Boodin's works called Religion of Tomorrow. And the new edition has a subtitle, A New Edition with an Introduction, including interpretive and explanatory notes. In addition, I think one thing that's helpful to know about Boodin here at the beginning is that when his book first came out in 1943, Edgar S. Brightman, described Boodin as a new Schleiermacher. He saw him as a pivotal figure coming into the scene. Flannery has 23 study entitled America's Forgotten Poet-Philosopher, the thought of John Elof Boodin in his time and ours. He's also written other books and articles at the intersection of science and religion, such as Nature's Prophet. And here we have another figure, Alfred Russel Wallace, and his evolution from natural selection to natural theology. And he's done a recent article called Neurology Meets Theology, Charles Sherrington's Gifford Lectures, Then and Now. In addition, he's written articles on evolution and teleology. He continues to write. He continues to stir the pot of intellectual thinking curiosity, and the relationship between the past and the future. Michael, we're so glad you're here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Elizabeth. Appreciate it.
We're in your hands.
Okay, so I'm up. So I want to thank Andrew Davis for inviting me to present on process philosophy and theology from a different perspective. One I suspect that most of you are unfamiliar with, and that is of John Elof Boodin. There's a reason I call him the forgotten poet philosopher, and I'll explain that as we proceed. But to me, this is exactly what the Center for Process Studies is all about. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank Mary Elizabeth, Richard, and Andrew for setting this up. So just a few initial facts about Boodin. The dates you see here are not birth and death dates. In fact, let's see here. 1900 to 1957 relates not to his birth and death dates, but to his first essay in 1900 to his posthumous papers in 1957. Boodin was born in Sweden on September 14th, 1869. He came to America in the summer of 1887, traveling in steerage with his sister Blenda. And with hard work and the help of a tight-knit Swedish immigrant community, was able to pursue an academic career by entering Harvard in 1897. Oops, sorry. He died on November the 14th, 1950 in California. So he traveled a great distance in his interesting lifetime. Well, it's all that in between that I want to discuss today. And I want to do so by beginning with some citation analysis that you see here. The bar graph indicates what we all know, and that is that far and away, the lion's share of citation analysis with regard to process studies comes from the source of Alfred North Whitehead. All the other possible individuals that you might see there also I've listed as Bergson, Hartshorne, Dewey, James, Peirce, Tudard, Josiah Royce. And then at the bottom, I didn't even have room for it. We've got Boodin at 784 stuck in the bottom. So I don't think there's any surprises here. Whitehead holds the lion's share. Looked at another way, if we compare Boodin with Whitehead, Boodin's piece of the process research pie from 1970 to present, Boodin possesses only about 6%. So a bare sliver with most of it going to Whitehead. Now, another way of looking at this is taking what I consider to be different trajectories of process thought. The most obvious is to take a look at Whitehead, Bergson, and Hartshorne compared to Peirce, Royce, and Boodin. Here they're ordered by prominence, but ordered chronologically, they'd be a little different for both groups. On the Whitehead side, they'd of course go from Bergson, who kicked things off with his doctoral dissertation, published as Time and Free Will, first appearing in France in 1889, and later, pardon me, translated into English in 1913, but especially with his magnum opus, of course, and that's Creative Evolution, translated into English in 1911. Then, of course, Whitehead first with his Tarner lectures delivered in November of 1919, published 1 year later as The Concept of Nature, then with Science in the Modern World, 1925, Religion in the Making, 1926, and then his magnum opus, Process and Reality, 1929. Now, there's, of course, others, but these are the main features. Finally, Charles Hartshorne carried Whitehead's thought forward in some amended form after his death in 1947. Now, with Peirce, Royce, and Boodin, it would start chronologically with Royce, whom Randy Auxier, whom some of you may know from Southern Illinois University, regards as the first process thinker with his 1880 essay on purpose and thought. This was later developed in The Problem of Job, published in 1898, and then fully expressed in The Problem of Christianity, 1913. Then Charles Sanders Peirce's semiotic or theory of signs certainly has considerable process connections, which he developed from 1903 to 1910. And then almost about the same time, Boodin from his first essay in 1900, then his metaphysics in 1916, on to his work on cosmic idealism in 1925, and subsequent works in the 1930s and 40s. So historically speaking, that's what we're largely talking about. These are the roots of modern process thought. And you can either, you can take the Whitehead, Bergson, Hartshorne trajectories or the Peirce, Royce, Boodin trajectories, which I've explained in some other works, take you through process thought in some ways to some different places. Now, in what way then, since we've opened this up, does Boodin relate to process thought? Now, of course, process thought is a big topic. I've reduced them down to what I would consider 7 points of process thought. Some might include others. Others are going to emphasize certain things over certain other things. But I would say these are basically 7 basic points that most process philosophers or theists are going to adhere to. And that would be primarily Plato over Aristotle, which is another way of saying form over function, process over substance. The idea of getting away from the divine maker moving things around like pieces on a chessboard to a more intimate and collaborative functional process. Then experience, Boodin certainly, we can dive into each of these, and then experience and indebtedness to pragmatism, teleology or purpose as a cosmic principle, 2 ultimates, God and cosmic immanence, God as panenthetic, theistic finitism, which is another way of saying that omnipresence does not necessarily mean omniscience or omnipotence for that matter. God and everything else is relational. So these are the 7 points. Now I'm going to dive into each of these with relation to Boodin a little bit so we can connect him up. Boodin acknowledged the debt to Plato. He had a significant one by saying after he had published his Cosmic Evolution, which is really his most comprehensive overview of his theory and ideas in 1925. He certainly hadn't completed them, but this was the largest overview. And he reread Plato's Timaeus, and he was happily surprised to discover Plato's footprints everywhere over the ground he had traversed, he said. So Boodin agreed with Whitehead that all philosophy is but footnotes to Plato. Experience and pragmatism, Boodin was deeply influenced by American pragmatism, as was Whitehead and so many other process thinkers. He was particularly influenced by William James. Nonetheless, experience was horizontal, not vertical for Boodin. And unlike some process theists, he was always wary of this vertical extension of experience with its panpsychic or pan-experientialist implications. In that sense, he seemed not to follow either Whitehead or David Ray Griffin. However, the pragmatic view was always before him. In his earliest publication in 1900, he acknowledged the influence of his dissertation director and mentor, Josiah Royce and his teacher friend William James, even writing an extensive, about 20 to 30 page eulogy to James upon his death in 1910. But Boodin admitted that it was Royce rather than James who was his true philosophical mentor. He said, Josiah Royce was the master with whom I wrestled for the salvation of my soul from 1897 to 1900. It was in Royce's seminar class that Boodin got his metaphysics. However, today, Boodin is generally regarded primarily as a pragmatist, and I'll have something more to say about that a little bit later. Teleology is a key cosmic principle which formed an important aspect of Boodin's thought, rejecting the reductionist and mechanistic excesses to which science and philosophy had fallen. As early as 1913, he called for the reinstatement of teleology back into science. All evolutionary processes must, for Boodin, include both mechanism and finalism. And let me just add that the old certainties of neo-Darwinian evolution are really crumbling under the weight of epigenetics, with serious objections to its gene-centric view voiced by credible experts in the field such as Dennis Noble, James Shapiro, Scott Turner, and others. But of course, this developed years after Boodin's passing. Nevertheless, it shows that Boodin's careful reading of science led him to some prescient philosophical conclusions. There are two ultimates, God and cosmic immanence. The eternal, necessary, and existent God is essentially creative, working toward novelty, and so are all the finite entities and actualities of this world. But for Whitehead, creativity is the universal of universals, a process whereby the many become one and are increased by one. Boodin departed from Whitehead on this, saying that everything in the universe isn't creative, but it's certainly its most interesting aspect. He didn't discount creativity, but he pointed out in Cosmic Evolution that in his posthumous papers, that creativity is a form of responsiveness in nature that can be equated with emergence. He agreed with Whitehead that creativity is a primordial principle, but not that it should be regarded as the universal of universals, because very many things in nature are simply repetitions and even mechanical in nature. Creativity implies synthesis and new emergence. There is no creativity in general, and at one point he says it does not help science one whit to postulate creativity as a universal, as Bergson does. So he attributed this in particular to Bergson. Instead, Boodin argues that cosmic immanence is the Hercules which can rescue direct experience from the onslaughts of epistemologists. I discuss this more fully in my article, The Voice of the Universe, but in a nutshell, it's essentially a cosmic formative field immanent throughout the multiple processes of nature. It's not static, but guiding. At one point, Boodin said, the world of sense, of solid mechanism, is but an island floating in the larger world of spiritual forces, in deriving its direction and significance from it. He actually disagreed with Einstein, who claimed that God does not play dice. He said, no, chance is always a factor in the world, but he replied, we are not duped when we believe that the dice of the universe are loaded for right and reason. God is panenthetic. Of course, Boodin never actually uses the term God is panenthetic. We can credit that, I think, to Charles Hartshorne. But he always speaks of God in panenthetic terms. As early as 1909, he criticized pantheism for being as unethical as materialism. A God that is identical with the totality of existence is as helpless to redeem the world as he is responsible for its sins and its virtues. God is identified with the absolute worth or goodness of the world, not its mere brute existence. He explains that God cannot be conceived as merely the whole of things. God must be conceived as an energizing spirit in the universe who furnishes the inspiration for creating an ideal realm of values, a kingdom of heaven in a distressed and struggling world. As early as 1900, Boodin described God as the great spectator and cooperator with the world who feels both its joys and its pains. And I think this is a very telling and process-related way of speaking of God. Theistic finitism, or the idea that God is omnipresent, but not omniscient or omnipotent. This should be familiar to a lot of process thinkers. This is simply because God has bestowed us with absolute freedom. God may attempt to persuade us or even lure us toward his will, but he does not dictate it. At one point, he says, if the conception of God by the Hebrew prophets had been dominated by the feeling for righteousness, and the Greek conception should be dominated by the feeling for beauty, it was inevitable that the Roman conception should be dominated by the feeling for power. And here we can find this first expressed by Augustine and then developed further in some unfortunate ways by Luther and ultimately Calvin. God is not an absolute dictator. Instead, God imposes an ever-present lure towards a cosmic moral and ethical principle that Boodin explained in a paper titled The Ought and Reality, published in the summer of 1907. And let me just add that this lure is an imposition of the ought, but lures, like laws, can be broken or ignored, but never without consequence. Boodin's conception of God is firmly rooted in transcultural oughts of moral and ethical imperatives, not wholly unlike the universal values expressed in C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And I think, as I've read everything that Boodin has written, Boodin never references C.S. Lewis, but he writes in a way that brings C.S. Lewis to mind on occasion. And I have never had C.S. Lewis brought to my mind by Whitehead. I'm not saying that's good, bad, or indifferent. I'm just saying it's a different sort of theological approach that Boodin has that I sometimes find somewhat akin to C.S. Lewis, and certainly in The Abolition of Man, and his emphasis on the transcultural ought is one of them. Finally, God and everything else is relational. Truth for Boodin always exists in relation to the larger whole, but also this relationality is expressed in our own social natures. Boodin wrote a book, a rather lengthy book, perhaps his biggest book, maybe almost 500 pages, called The Social Mind, which he published in 1939. For Boodin, thought cannot be understood as isolated and cut off from the rest of the universe. It can arise only in the interaction of social relations. It presupposes an intersubjective continuum. And I might add that if you hop onto the website of the Cobb Institute, they have a quote from the recently departed John Cobb, who's clearly an icon in the field, as saying, if we want a society in which the sense of belonging is strong, people are concerned for one another, and there is a strong commitment to the common good, we need a metaphysics that shows that we are in fact part of larger societies and have no existence apart from our relations to others. And Boodin certainly believed this, and moreover was saying it in essays written well over 100 years ago. So there we have it. Boodin was and is a process thinker by all of these measures. But this begs the question, why haven't we heard more about him? So in my time remaining, I want to explore this by suggesting 5 reasons for his comparative obscurity. Here are 3 men who had tremendous influence over Boodin. Royce gave him his idealism and his process metaphysic. James gave him his pragmatism. But I want to focus briefly on the fellow standing in the back, George Herbert Palmer. He sets the stage for the rest of Boodin's career. Now, Palmer was one of those faculty members better known as an administrative yes man for the university. And, I suppose we've all met them. Palmer was certainly one of them. In the philosophy department at Harvard, um, all of the careers were pretty closely managed by George Herbert Palmer. Arthur Child, who had been a student of Boodin's, thought that Palmer was a great snob, a total non-entity, but one who could set the course for one's future on a whim, or in Boodin's case, on a prejudice, by thinking that Boodin's strong Swedish accent was inappropriate for Harvard society, so he recommended him off to the Midwest, where he thought he belonged. Here he never acquired the intellectual influence he might have exerted in the East, so that sort of set the stage for what would follow. And here's where he sent him. He sent him, I don't know if you can see on the bottom there, he sent him to Grinnell College from 1900 to 1904. And we need only follow Boodin's career to see the impact that this had in contributing to his isolation. Now, don't get me wrong. Pardon me. Today, Grinnell has a great reputation. It's a wonderful school. But that reputation was made by holding writers' workshops and a symposium with great writers of the day, particularly from the 50s and 60s, writers like Arthur Koestler, Flannery O'Connor, and so forth. But when Boodin was there in 1900 to 1904, that was well in the future of what would become Grinnell College. When he went there, it was called Iowa College. And let me tell you, it was the American hinterland. Then he went for a difficult stretch at Kansas from 1904 to 1912, where he had difficulties with the administration there. I had to X out Kansas State University because even though this postcard says Kansas State University is actually 80 miles away in Manhattan, Kansas. It is not in Lawrence, Kansas. The picture is right. Lawrence, Kansas is right. It is the north entrance of Kansas University. And this is pretty much what it would have looked like when Boodin arrived there in 1904. At any rate, his next time was spent at Carleton College from 1913 to 1927, a very productive period for him, but at Northfield, Minnesota, still geographically isolated at the time when geography mattered. He did some of his best work here at Carleton, and I think in some ways was very happy at Carleton. He wrote A Realistic Universe in 1916. He wrote Cosmic Evolution in 1925, not to mention numerous articles in the professional journals of the day. Then he finally finished out his career at UCLA, which frankly sounds a little more impressive than it really was. For one thing, he was located far from Whitehead's Harvard and Hartshorne's School of Divinity at the University of Chicago, both of whom were able to surround themselves with devoted graduate students, apostles to the process cause. In contrast, Boodin had no intellectual offspring. His fledgling UCLA philosophy department did not graduate its first PhD student until 1942, 3 years after Boodin's retirement. Although Boodin did have the opportunity to teach at the graduate level during his tenure, it only offered the master's degree. It was really Hans Reichenbach, who had already established himself as an important philosopher of science in Germany, that put UCLA on the map of significant American philosophical institutions. Fleeing from Nazi persecution, Reichenbach settled in LA in 1938, 1 year before Boodin's retirement. So they evidently met one another, but probably didn't get much of a chance to know one another. At UCLA, great 20th century American philosophers, including C.G. Peter Hempel, he was a visiting associate professor there for a while, Wesley Salmon, Hilary Putnam, all bore the Reichenbach UCLA stamp. And at Reichenbach's death, Rudolf Carnap succeeded him there. All of this preceded Boodin. Until then, to be a philosopher at UCLA meant a degree of academic isolation. It's unfortunate that in academia, demography can often make or break reputations more readily than ideas. But I think for Boodin, that certainly seems to at least be partially the case. The third reason is the overall direction of philosophy in the 20th century. There was an emphasis upon the verificationism of logical positivism that was inimical to Boodin's type of pragmatic idealism, all promoted by the influential Vienna Circle that rejected metaphysics as useless speculation. Boodin's emphasis on metaphysics also came at a time when American philosophy was taking a linguistic turn away from such grand theorizing and was becoming dominated by reductionist philosophies of materialism and physicalism. Adding to this was the unfortunate development of subjectivism as it relates to values. The idea that values are subjective. It would take Hilary Putnam many, many years later to shine a light on this with his excellent book, The Collapse of the Fact-Value Dichotomy, which wasn't published until 2002. Boodin fought an unpopular battle against these isms, leaving him marginalized and neglected. This prejudice persists as when he is unfavorably compared to the materialist Roy Wood Sellers' critical realism and chided for distancing himself from pragmatism in favor of his own functional realism. Matthias Neuber writes an article about this in which he castigates Boodin for this, published in 2019. He says that, well, Boodin got lost in the isms, but I think this is based on a skewed reading of Boodin. It's rather Sellers, I think, who got lost in his isms, the reductionist critical realism that he had developed and its attendant brain state materialism. So I just discussed this in my book, The Forgotten Poet Philosopher. This leads to the fourth factor playing a role in Boodin's obscurity, and that is the unfortunate timing of his major publications. If you look at these publications, his major metaphysical work, which is A Realistic Universe, came out in the midst of World War I in 1916. You see that listed as number 4 there. And then he had a string of important publications that were issued during the Great Depression. And then finally, Religion of Tomorrow, that took an unfortunate backseat to World War II. So obviously, much of Boodin's publication period was published during a time of great distraction. But I also want to point out that at least half of this list came out before Whitehead's Process and Reality, and a few while Whitehead was still immersed in mathematics with Bertrand Russell rather than in metaphysics. Related to this is a fifth reason for Boodin's obscurity, which I had alluded to earlier, and that is more recent attention being paid to Boodin's pragmatism rather than his process thought. For example, John Shook's extremely useful annotated bibliography, Pragmatism, came out in 1998, includes Boodin's work as a pragmatist. And if you want a comprehensive annotated list of his works up to 1940, this is it. It's quite good. But again, it focuses on his pragmatism, not on his process thought. Here's the reprinting of his 1911 Truth and Reality, which is given on the right-hand side of the screen there. It casts him as a pragmatist, indeed, as volume 2 of the series Early Defenders of Pragmatism. This was published in 2001. His work was also featured in volume 3 of the Cambridge School of Pragmatism, published in 2006. Now, Boodin's biography in 1987, in my book more recently, tried to resurrect his reputation. And Charles Chuck Nelson's book gives an excellent biographical portrait of his life, and I'm so glad to have him in the audience today. My book centers on Boodin's thought. His centers on Boodin's life. And I have to tell you, I really could not have launched into my book if I had not had access to Chuck Nelson's excellent book on John Elof Boodin. He gives a very good, straightforward analysis of his life and in all of its twists and turns. So it's an excellent biography. I can't recommend it more highly. Both of these books point out that although Boodin was sympathetic to pragmatism, he never became an avowed pragmatist. In fact, he always thought that the ire aroused by his 1909 article, What Pragmatism Is and Is Not, was directly due to his being considered an outsider to pragmatism. Well, why didn't Boodin ever declare openly for pragmatism, as his old friend and teacher, William James, had certainly wanted him to do? Well, Boodin never answers this question, but I think G.K. Chesterton gives the best answer in orthodoxy, and I don't think Boodin would have disagreed. Chesterton said, "The pragmatist tells a man to think what he must think and never mind the absolute. But precisely one of the things that he must think is the absolute. This philosophy, indeed, is a kind of verbal paradox. Pragmatism is a matter of human needs, and one of the first human needs is to be something more than a pragmatist." And even though Boodin may not have stated this, I think he felt it. And I think that's always why he pulled back from openly joining James as a full-blown pragmatist. We have to remember that Royce spoke often of the absolute, and while Boodin's absolute may not have exactly been that of Royce's, there most assuredly is an absolute in all of Boodin's works. Boodin was a functional realist whose overall philosophy was one of cosmic idealism. In fact, the subtitle to his book, Cosmic Evolution, is Outlines of Cosmic Idealism. And functional realism is the culmination or epitome of Boodin's metaphysical system. It says that things exist only in fields, in mutuality with other things. They have properties only in their interrelations. The world is real. Nature is what it does, a phrase that Boodin often liked to use. Therefore, Boodin's metaphysical system may be said to be one of dynamic interrelationships united in an intimate embrace of empirical realism, which is the method, and cosmic idealism, which is the conclusion or culmination. So let's look at that just a little more closely. And if we look at Boodin's metaphysic through his realistic universe, either the 1916 or the 1931 editions, because few changes were made to the second edition, except to update a couple of paragraphs on recent development in physics, none of which changed his metaphysical categories or explanations. So those categories for Boodin are first, energy and things; second, consciousness and mind; third, space; fourth, time; and fifth, form. So there's 5 categories of existence and reality and 19 categories of explanation. Whitehead has 8 categories of existence and reality and 27 categories of explanation. I'll let the audience read Boodin for themselves and decide whether Boodin's application of Occam's razor was a careful scalpel or indiscriminate chainsaw. I think it has some merit, but don't take it from me. You can take it from Clifford Barrett, whose review of Boodin's second addition to the realistic universe said, in its treatment of qualities and relations and in its account of structure, hereto meagerly suggested, Professor Boodin's book not only deserves the most earnest consideration of students of philosophy, but also recognition as an important contribution to philosophical thought. And he had other laudatory things to say, but this didn't seem to get picked up or carried forward too much amongst his colleagues, unfortunately. And Canadian philosopher Leslie Armour called Boodin Whitehead's most impressive rival. He concluded that John Elof Boodin may have had as much insight as Whitehead and a more coherent system, but he was not a celebrated mathematician with a standing in physics. I would add he was not a celebrated mathematician with a standing in physics from Harvard. Again, where you're from can be as important as what you say, sometimes more so. But I'm not here, and this is important, I'm not here to replace Whitehead. This is certainly not an either or situation. I simply want to say that what we learned from this is that Boodin didn't suffer for his ideas. He suffered due to his circumstance, a man institutionally and geographically isolated, a man at the wrong place at the wrong time, a man with no cadre of graduate students to send forth as apostles to the process cause, and whose process thought took a backseat to pragmatism. Here I'll finish with a Whitehead citation analysis trend line. If you look at 1990, you'll see a lot fewer citations, of course, but if you compare theology, the blue line, with philosophy, the green line, almost 70% of all Whitehead citations have something to do with theology. By 2023, that's no longer the case, and it's almost been flipped to only 28.12% of Whitehead citations having anything to do with theology. So that might be cause for concern for those of us who think that process theology is important. Not that Whitehead is necessarily an impediment to that, but it certainly shows a trend line away from it for whatever reasons. I would suggest why not add another lane or two or three or four to the process highway? Would the richness of process thought be diminished by thoughtfully examining others like Boodin, or maybe others like Wilman Sheldon? He wrote The Strife of Systems and Productive Duality in 1918. And then obviously as a play on process and reality, he wrote Process and Polarity in 1942 that probably deserve a closer look. Maybe the 19th century German philosopher Gustav Fechner deserves closer scrutiny, and not as someone Charles Hartshorne happened to admire, but as a process thinker in his own right. And what about the Russian process thinker Semyon Frank? Other than Teresa Obelevich's recent article in 2023, who knows anything about him? I don't think John Dewey or Edgar S. Brightman should be forgotten as process thinkers either. And as Mary Elizabeth said, when Brightman read Boodin's Religion of Tomorrow, he called him a new Schleiermacher. So I would say, along with Boodin, let's get to work. Let's broaden the field. Bergson, yes. Whitehead, yes. Sure, why not look at Hartshorne in greater detail, and John Cobb as well. But process thought and process theology can be so much more if we adopt a pluralist approach and examine lesser known figures, but not necessarily lesser significant figures, who have been process thinkers in their own right. And so I would say perhaps look at these and maybe some others as well. So hopefully I've given us all some food for thought and maybe a path for further research and inquiry. That's basically what I wanted to present today. Thank you.
Michael, this has been outstanding. You made me want to take one of your courses. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
And we'll welcome now Andrew Davis into this circle, and you and he can launch the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary Elizabeth and Michael. Yeah, thanks very much. Very stimulating. You have me convinced that I need to be deepening my research in the direction of Boodin. So thanks very much. Michael was kind enough, everybody, to send me a few copies of his books. I won't guarantee he'll do that for you, but I do want to encourage you all to check out his work. Before I pose my first question, and I don't want to dominate here because I want to get to everyone else's questions too, I do want to post in the chat a wonderful article he's also recently published titled Rethinking Modern Process Thought, a brief historiographical survey. It's an open access article there in the link, and you can access it there. And you'll see some of the important points that he's been bringing up in the talk today, reiterated there in more detail. Well, Michael, one of the things I mentioned to you in email correspondence was that I'm working on a new introduction to Whitehead. And it's been a playful challenge, but it's aimed for early undergraduate students of philosophy. And I have one chapter on the modern process tradition. And so you've convinced me that I now need to have at least the name, if not a small section on Boodin's work. So I think I'm going to be adding that. And one of the points you make in your presentation here, as well as the article I just posted, is that, we may have limited the process tradition by attention to Whitehead, which has been positive and productive, but that it's limited the reach of what the process tradition can do in its reception. And I think of there's this apocryphal story of Whitehead on his deathbed, surrounded by students of his. And he says, "I don't want any disciples." And they respond, "Yes, master." And you're sort of playing with the unfortunate nature of that the tradition, if it becomes too centered on one figure, we end up losing the richness of the plurality of the tradition. So that's all to say, I think you're doing wonderful work. I just want to ask one question to you, and then we can open it up to others. Let's invert the history of modern process thought. What if, for fun, we imagine that instead of Boodin being sidelined for a variety of historically contingent reasons, but that it was Whitehead? And let's assume Whitehead was in the background and Boodin's thought became the central pivot around which modern process theology in particular would develop and evolve. And so I wonder, if that were the case, what do you imagine does he offer in terms of process theology, or the reception even of process theology, that might be lacking in the Whitehead-centric view? It's an imaginative question, but I'd be interested to hear what those differences might be in your perspective.
You mean, let me make sure I understand your question.
Yeah.
So are you saying let's flip the history and assume Boodin has ascendancy versus Whitehead?
Yes. Right.
And then what specifically would Whitehead bring to the table in terms of modern process? Is that your question?
Not quite. So let's assume Boodin rises to ascendancy, Whitehead pales into the background. Process theology is developed around Boodin's thought as opposed to Whitehead's thought.
Right.
So what sort of unique features, either in the doctrine or in the reception of process theology, do you think might rise to the surface there?
Well, let me just say this, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit in my presentation, but I can maybe double down a little bit on it. Boodin's God is not exactly Whitehead's God. They both had God. They were both important parts of their metaphysical structures. And despite what some think, I personally don't think you could take God out of Whitehead and still make it work. But
I would agree with you on that.
That's another conversation, isn't it? Neither did John Cobb, by the way.
Yeah.
But I would say, remember when I said, periodically when I read Whitehead, certain phrases or images or ideas from C.S. Lewis come to mind. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is Boodin's God, and it comes out, I think, much more forcefully, more strongly in Religion of Tomorrow, which is in some ways my favorite book that he wrote. He wants to revitalize the church. The church is important for Boodin in that sense, because he sees it as a social institution. and strengthening the social relations of humanity. But he also sees God as a saving God, a God of salvation, a God of redemption. That's not particularly the God that comes to mind when I think about Whitehead. I'm good, bad, or indifferent. It's just when I read Whitehead, I don't get that sense of God. I do get that sense from Boodin, and I guess to answer your question, if that were the case, I think we would see a process theology very firmly rooted in the development of a church of a process-related deity that was saving and redemptive, but not in, sort of the dictatorial sense. It's certainly not a Calvinistic sort of God. But I think that's what, and in fact, curiously enough, Boodin always said, yes, we need a revitalization. We need a religion of tomorrow, but we cannot have a religion of tomorrow without forgetting yesterday. So he was interested in keeping many of those traditions and moving them forward in a productive way. In fact, for example, and you'll have to read the book, he thought there should be actually more sacraments than were presently instituted in the church. He thought we should have some social sacraments, a sacrament of citizenship, for example. I'm not saying necessarily that would work, but that's the way he thinks.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. That's great. Yeah, it is interesting that that concern for the church is something, or at least that more overt concern for the church in Boodin seems to be lacking in Whitehead. Mm-hmm. Partly given his contingencies of his history. And of course, all these contingencies, which makes Whitehead ascend and Boodin descend, as it were, are a part of the process universe. And it's sort of flux, the stubborn flux. I just think it's interesting, though, this element of Whitehead as a saving God. Well, I guess historically it's interesting that while many philosophers tend to dismiss Whitehead, his thought initially was quite important for theology. And I wonder, this element of salvation would seem to be an essential part of that. And just one quote comes to mind. And of course, we don't have to debate all of Whitehead's thought, but that God is the poet of the world, who Whitehead says does not create the world, but saves it. Right. And of course, we can debate what the nature of that salvation is. Like, in my perspective, it's like the salvation of actuality so that it doesn't close in upon itself for lack of possibility. What God gives the world and the mode of salvation is the possible. But I just see some interesting overlaps, and you've just given me a lot of energy to explore. The last thing I'll say before we open it up is when you said that Boodin mentioned God as the great spectator and cooperator, I recalled Whitehead's statement as God is the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. Right. So, yeah, so thank you very much, Michael. And I'm going to be